My name is Ina Kim Lee, and I'm a senior researcher at the Secretariat of the Association of World Election Bodies. So today's webinar is part of a series that the EU Secretariat has been hosting alongside our partner organizations to provide all of our 170 members with a platform to share experiences and knowledge on the topic of election management. This webinar holds the purpose of sharing the experiences of the African region in the topic of dissemination of electoral information to voters in time of crisis. This webinar is being co-hosted alongside the University of South Africa and the National Election Commission of the Republic of Korea. One of the challenges that crisis situations like COVID-19 have created is the inability to hold face-to-face meetings. Just like we're doing, many activities in the electoral calendar have been shifted to online platforms. The purpose of this webinar is to focus on the challenges EMBs have in disseminating information to all voters due to crises like Ebola and COVID-19. EMBs and other election stakeholders have taken different roles during this crisis, trying to guarantee accessibility to information to all voters. The presenters today will share diverse experiences and lessons learned on holding elections during crisis and relaying relevant information to voters. I would like to first introduce the speaker that will open this session. I would like to introduce Mr. Rushdie Nakerdien, who is the Regional Director of IFES for the region of Africa. Wait a moment. Unfortunately, because of the time difference, because Mr. Rushdie Nakerdien is based in Washington, D.C., he will not be here today. He has sent us a pre-recorded presentation, so we will take a look at that video. I would like to ask everyone to have a little bit of patience with the video since we're trying to view it and there could be some buffering, but we'll start now.
Thank you very much. And greetings to everybody who has signed into this webinar. It's indeed a great pleasure to be here. My name is Rushdie Nakerdien. I work as the IFES Africa Director based in Washington, D.C. IFES is the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, and we have been working in the field of election support to election management bodies for more than 30 years already. In that regard, IFES has worked in almost half the countries in Africa, and in particular has been very active during some of the pandemics that we've seen, in particular Ebola in West Africa, and then most recently the COVID-19 crisis. We are here today to talk about issues of voter education and the issues associated with poll worker training. I'll start my presentation by talking about the challenge of elections during COVID. I mean, elections are generally community events. They are public events where communities gather to express their right to vote through very tangible means, mainly through paper ballots on the African continent. This represents multiple moments of exposure for not only election officials, but ordinary voters as they exercise their political rights. The COVID crisis has been a moment of forced innovation for election officials across the world. It is a moment of significant social change as we see communities worldwide struggle to adapt to this new reality. We need to, in our work, seek to reduce exposure of officials and voters. We need to look at safeguarding the electoral process as well as safeguarding the people that we work with at the end of the day. The challenge here overall, and coming out of our adaptation to COVID-19, is to build back better. How do we increase the level of inclusion associated with elections? How do we develop greater resilience within our own institutions to fight against this pandemic and future pandemics? And how do we cultivate trust in democracy through this particular process? The particular challenges that emerge here are the fact that this is an era of social media. We do have a process by which misinformation is spread at the push of a button, and almost on a daily basis, we see the emergence of new facts associated with the virus and its implications, and that requires us to be in a very reactive mode. By the same token, with all of the social media floating around and citizens being confused about what's right and what's not right, workplaces we see are starting to become critical role players in the confirmation around information. And that's a critical role that all workplaces play, and EMBs in particular when it comes to the public. During this time period, the information universe might be saturated by information coming from government or health authorities, but it's critical that election management bodies do not disappear off this, from this universe. Trust building is key, and this is a critical moment that election management bodies, especially with elections coming up, can play a key role when it comes to investing in trust. We as EMBs and officials working in this arena are experts, and we need to assume this leadership role when it comes to the spread of information. We know that chaotic elections lead to the decline in trust in electoral outcomes, and we also know that the once familiar election processes that people are used to may increase changes to that might increase confusion amongst voters and other electoral stakeholders. Within all of this, it's really pivotal that we understand our audience. And this is where we start getting into the issues confronting issues of voter education, as well as working with our officials who will be in polling stations. We need to collect, we need to understand, and we need to analyze gender, age, disability, and other relevant identity-based disaggregated data. This allows us to start being much more targeted in our approach. We recognize that elections cost a lot of money. And during these times, our budgets will definitely be strained as we look to invest far more in securing polling stations, making sure that they are safe, making sure officials are safe. They need to be supplied with personal protective equipment. And this takes away money from other areas. The one area that tends to suffer most is on voter education. And it is here that our ability to have data and make targeted strategic decisions will help quite significantly in terms of that budget balancing issue which will always arise. We're needing to understand the distinctions between voters that are in cities, voters out in rural areas. We need to understand what messaging works and how best to get those messaging out. So all in all, we needing to be far more strategic and smart about how we go about our voter education messaging. We need to recognize that misinformation is very prevalent. There's a lot of hate speech during election campaigns, which also gets spread, and the election management body itself could be targeted in this misinformation campaign. So part of our preparation around communications also needs to focus on things like crisis communications. That needs to be an integral part of any voter education approach these days. We need to look carefully and monitor what is happening, set in place social listening to track myths that are being distributed. But then we need to be careful how we approach that. We must today and in these ages look at our social media channels. These are low-cost mechanisms by which which are under our control, our Facebook sites, our Twitter sites, Instagrams, all of these channels are things which we can use and which we can use to combat any of the myths that are spread out on social media generally. And we need to be very proactive about false or misleading narratives. Critically, and this also relates to the issue of training our officials, we need to address both amongst officials as well as voters the issues of stigma and fears associated with the pandemic. Our officials need to know that they will be supplied with PPE or personal protective equipment, but also know that the process has been adjusted in such a way that they will not be unnecessarily exposed to the virus. Voters need to know that when they go to the polls that they will be safe in that kind of environment, and the risk of contracting COVID in that kind of a space will be significantly lessened, and the fact that the election management body has taken action around that. For that, we are not health experts. We need to collaborate with our ministries of health, other health authorities, other task forces that are active in this particular space, but then also very critically, ministries of education when it comes to distribution of information, and a whole range of other task forces active in this space. This is not something that we need to work on our own, and we need to find ways to work far more collaboratively. When it comes to the fact that we are in a time period where we're told to social distance, that we have to adjust our messaging because we can't do all of the face-to-face kind of engagements, one of the mediums that I would constantly recommend on the African continent that people should not lose sight of is, before the days of the internet, the use of community radio. The use of community radio is incredibly prominent. It reaches a wide array of audiences across our different countries, both in urban and rural settings. And these are areas that we need to invest quite a lot into. A variety of languages are used by community radio as they use the vernacular, and we can also look very seriously at using radio to distribute lessons associated with the training of our polling officials. A very versatile medium, something which people in these days of social media pay a lot less attention to, but in the African setting, very critical. When it comes to face-to-face training of our polling officials, we are needing to adjust. We are finding that if it was not for the internet, many of us would not be able to do our work. As our offices might have been closed for a period of time, we've had to adjust to working from home. The same applies to the training of our officials. The likelihood that online learning as the only means of training, that it is super effective, I believe in the African continent will be very limited. The combination, though, of online learning or e-learning with some face-to-face elements has great value. And here we need to look at the production of training videos that would be useful for people to be able to watch during WhatsApp sessions, or sessions which require a blend of online abilities as well as some face-to-face learnings, obviously with COVID prevention measures in place, the social distancing, the wearing of masks, the sanitizing of hands, and so forth. I've already mentioned the fact that we are needing to collaborate quite strongly, but critically, I would like to recommend that we also reach out key to civil society organizations. Civil society organizations are an incredibly good amplifier of messages which the election management body puts out. And we've seen in places we would hear from our colleagues from Malawi about how they've worked with civil society organizations in conjunction to be able to put out messaging with regards to voter education and post-election civic education as well. Within the African continent, IFES has in recent times worked very actively in helping election commissions with regards to COVID-19 in places like Nigeria, in places like Ethiopia, Malawi, Democratic Republic of Congo, the Gambia, Niger, and Guinea. Guinea just having had elections very recently. And in these countries, some of the areas that we've helped with have been on the development of COVID-19 policies, which I believe Nigeria is one of the model policies on the continent, and really shows us what could be done, which allows the policy to cater for polling stations, voter education, procurement, a whole array of different areas. We also have been helping with risk assessments with regards to COVID-19, looking at vulnerabilities. We have been working with some election commissions to review their training materials from a COVID-19 perspective. We have been helping some election management bodies put in place online learning sessions where they've become accustomed to Zoom, as many of you are now well accustomed to as well. We've looked at the costing of PPE and then on voter education in particular. Some of these, one would ask, why should the election management body be so engaged on COVID-19 versus working on elections per se? The two are completely intertwined. The elections do not take place in a vacuum, and we have a critical role to play when it comes to this. We do need to recognize that COVID-19 does compel us to spend longer time to plan and more time to prepare for our election activities. We need to be much more smart in our approaches. In doing so, we do need to look at extending the franchise. We need to look at how our actions and behaviors are as inclusive as possible. Voters need to know that they can participate in elections freely. They can do so independently, and this particularly applies to voters with special needs, as well as secretly. And all of those elements need to be protected. Here, we need to particularly tackle the main barriers to marginalized groups' electoral and political engagement. We also have to be concerned about those groups that during these times might be self-isolating, either through issues of disability or issues of age. During this time period, we are compelled to be innovative, and we need to kind of think out of the box. Many election political parties are constrained in themselves in terms of campaigning. There are limitations in the number of people that could gather during rallies. These are areas that we are needing to look at how best to assist, and we are seeing some election management bodies create a platform on their own website to allow parties to spread information. This also allows for the monitoring of that kind of messaging, very key. Critical things out of voter education that we've learned is to limit the number of messages that you're trying to put out. Look at putting out one idea at a time. Don't provide 3 or 4 instructions, which can be confusing voters. And I'm talking about no more than 3 or 4. So, for example, reminding people they need to sanitize their hands, not touch their face or unnecessary surfaces, wearing face masks, keeping social distances, bringing ID books or their identity documents. These are all critical messagings that can go together. Using a positive and active tone and voice, to guide voters in the messaging that you put out. So you talk about sanitize your hands before and after voting, rather than don't vote and leave the polling station without sanitizing your hands. Those are two very different messages. Choose your words very carefully. Use short sentences, simple and familiar words. Avoid the big technical and scientific jargon or unnecessary abbreviations and so forth. Language must be culturally appropriate. Look carefully at the selection of your visuals. Your images need to signal inclusion. And for that, they need to incorporate a diversity of people and embrace that diversity. It needs to speak to marginalized voters. It needs to speak to persons with disabilities. And all of those need to be incorporated in the visuals that you're putting out there. So those are just a few suggestions in this particular area. When it comes to the training of polling officials, we need to recognize that the online sessions we might incorporate in our training requires far more preparation time than usually anticipated. We need to invest quite heavily in our training of trainers or training of facilitators, so that they are not just accustomed with technology if it's going to be used, but they're accustomed to the COVID-19 messages that are used, as well as the changes which will be effected in the electoral process. Rehearsals and practice are non-negotiable. You want to be able to have that, to see and that officials have consistent messages that they carry out there. And I think one of the things is also to recognize that if you are going to be doing blended learning, where you're combining online learning with classrooms, you do need to worry about the ability of facilitators in these sessions, because doing online sessions, it exhausts you. You don't have the body language cues that you normally would have in a face-to-face kind of a session. It requires far more concentration. It requires bigger teams. You've got to have somebody who looks after the IT issues, somebody who's looking after any chats that might be coming through WhatsApp and so forth. These are very key suggestions here. I would then also say that we need to recognize that COVID-19 training adaptations are hard, they are taxing, and yet they represent an opportunity for us to improve our training methodologies as well. It compels us to think about how to keep people active in a setting where there's social distancing, where you cannot have the sharing of equipment like pens, stationery, things like that. It does give us an opportunity to think through things differently. I mean, we are compelled to. And as I draw to a close here, both voter education and the training of polling officials gives us really an opportunity to build back better. This COVID will pass at a particular point. We will hopefully have vaccines. Our medical professionals will know a lot more about how to prevent the spread of COVID. And during this time period, we have got a unique opportunity to increase the way that we look at issues of inclusion, marginalized voters, vulnerable voters, and how do we address, through being smarter and working more strategically with the funds that we have available, how do we address communities that we might have traditionally not paid so much attention to. And this is where the innovative use of community radio combined with social media, internet, combined with some COVIDly sensitive face-to-face kind of gatherings can be important. Our own institutions need to become much more resilient. We recognize that many of us were compelled to start working from home, have much more structure and rigidity attached to our work. And this is where we need to look carefully at the resilience building measures that we can be putting in place. And then ultimately, this is an opportunity for us to cultivate trust among citizens in democracies. election management bodies are one of the few entities that are able to touch uh, uh, voting citizens in a very direct way through the delivery of a service around the elections. And therein lies a unique opportunity that to improve the quality of that service, even recognizing the many challenges that there are. This is a unique opportunity. We need to think beyond the elections. Potentially our efforts around elections has us maybe focused beyond elections, more around issues of civic education. How do we cultivate more democratic norms through schools or through working with civil society organizations? And this is where the COVID-19 crisis provides us with a unique opportunity to build back better and to improve the way that we've been working up till now. I'll pause there and thank everybody for your attention.
So it kind of looked like he was already here, doesn't it? But we want to thank Mr. Rushdie Nakardian for speaking beforehand. And for those who did not get listen to the whole video, once we are done with this webinar, we'll be sharing the videos as well as the presentations with all the participants. And I think it's very important what he said, that we should try to see how we can blend both the community radio, social media, and internet, so that we can see how we can improve our methods for providing voter education to our citizens. Now we will welcome Dr. Samadoma Fikeni, who's the Director of Special Projects and Advisor to the Chancellor Principal at the University of Africa. Dr. Fineki has worked as a researcher and lecturer in different institutions and has a vast experience as a consultant and trainer on policy-related matters. He has been involved in initiatives to coordinate programs to popularize and implement the African Union Agenda 2063 and was the initiator of this program in the SADC region. So I would like to introduce you once again. Dr. Samadoma, when you're ready, you may begin your presentation.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, and also greetings to the organizers as well as AWEB, which is in partnership with UNISA, and our, Korean Commission. And let me start by saying that as a follow-up to the previous speaker, COVID-19 is arguably the worst global crisis of the 21st century, and arguably one of the worst in living memory. And we may have to learn to live with these pandemics because they've become more frequent in the 21st century. And hence some of the people, if you move to the next slide, call it a black swan event because it was least expected. But by all indications, it will usher in a new world order or a new epoch because of its massive disruptive impact. And such a new world order will be the same as you have seen in the post-Second World War or in the post-Cold War period, where the global system might have to make significant adjustments in its political, social, environmental, and economic spheres. And we are unlikely to be the same. If you move to the next slide, even when you face a crisis, there is always an opportunity in a crisis wherein you are able to explore new opportunities, use new platforms. Hence, Churchill said, never let a good crisis go to waste. And you also have another quote where it is saying, you never let a serious crisis go to waste. And what I mean by that is an opportunity to do things you could not do before comes in during this crisis period. Next slide, please. In our context in South Africa, we have not yet had elections, but in a few days' time, we are going to be having a number of by-elections, most of which were postponed because of COVID-19. And these are local elections which will be held on the 11th of November. We've already seen the campaigning, we've already seen the preparations and how COVID-19 has impacted this. Of course, campaign has been low-key and mainly it has been in the social media. And that in itself, I do think that is worth noting. And you may also look at the American presidential elections and how it has been affected, not only by how the COVID-19 was handled, but the mechanisms of handling these elections. Of course, when you have the new opportunities that come, such as the social media, they grow exponentially in the era of digital mass communication. You also have the risks, as you heard, that the cyber attacks, fake news, and effort to manipulate the same spaces is equally a possibility. So that in itself also increases the risk of the election outcomes being compromised. Therefore, there is a need to increase the digital platform securities. Even electronic voting itself has had its own challenges. As I move to the next slide, the key thing here in the next slide is that COVID-19 in the South African context has exposed societal fault lines and has amplified some of the weaknesses within our systems. South Africa is one of the most unequal societies in the world. And as such, COVID-19 and working from home, e-commerce, e-governance, e-learning, and many other things have exposed the digital divide, where the poor are struggling to access the internet. They are struggling to have the smartphones, the computers, the tablets, or the gadgets for them to access those. And also you do have an inhibitive data cost, which makes it impossible for people to meaningfully participate in this space. That in itself include the reliability and the robustness of the internet, platform or the infrastructure or the broadband. So these have raised a sharp focus on this issue because it is about time that the country will have to invest heavily in this space so that you have greater participation, not along the class lines, even worse in South Africa, where class and race tend to have a close correlation. Of course, I've spoken about the vulnerability to fake news in the post-truth era of geopolitical volatility and the wave of populism, which is often peddled in the social media space. Now, the lack of credible democracy education platform, especially in the internet space or the digital mass communication, which is saturated with many other things which have nothing to do with election education or democracy education or civic education. That's why I support the idea of mainstreaming this education, this particular awareness into our education system and into our mass, broadcast platforms, because that will go a long way to incapacitate people to be able to distill between fake news, to distill between things which are important and less important in their democratic life. Of course, there is also a growing legitimacy crisis of the multi-party constitutional democracy, which is likely to be widened by the digital mass communication if there is no mass education.
커뮤니케이션 시대에서 더욱 부각이 되고 있는데요. 저희가 민주주의에 대한 그런 교육이 필요합니다. 포퓰리즘이 더욱더 많이 일어나고 있고요. 그리고 또 이 취약 계층이 많은 피해를 보고 있는 것을 볼 수가 있습니다. 그래서 선거관리 기관들도 또 피해를 보고 있습니다. 네, 다음 슬라이드로 넘어가 주시기 바랍니다.
Now, in the restrictions that we've talked about because of the health concerns and the heavy reliance on media and internet platform to relay the messages, opposition parties during this restriction period have complained that they are generally left out as the focus is on the governing party and the ministers who are dealing with the pandemic. And some of the institutions such as Parliament during the heavy lockdown have been locked down such that they could not have an interaction or even the oversight. Of course, that is easing a little bit. The issue of economic crisis that is pounding the country and many other African countries means it will be very difficult for many political parties to raise funds. And that issue is raising yet again the issue of party funding, because many companies will claim that COVID-19 has wiped out their revenues. And going forward, it means those parties which are well connected or which have war chest will be the ones which will handle the situation better. Can we move to the next slide, please? The second part of this, what we project, is that in countries where economies are not doing well, many people tend to stampede and rush into politics. Now, getting into that ticket of a political party, getting into that electoral system or the list to be considered for elections is going to be a lot more intense. At times, undemocratic means are likely to be used because this becomes the only way of social mobility or accessing resources or having secure employment. And that in itself may actually cause some harm if not well regulated. Of course, I've spoken about the digital divide. Prolonged postponements may lead to all kinds of legitimacy crisis. That's why using modern platforms, even when it looks difficult, it's most likely going to be the way. You see the complaint about the mail voting in the US. It means that even using the modern systems will be challenged by some, especially those who believe they will be disadvantaged by it. So that has to be that has to be understood and preempted. I've spoken about the party funding, this frequency of cyber attacks, which means greater investment in the security of systems, becomes very important. In social sciences, in the next slide, we talk of the VUCA moment, where volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous environment is going to be a norm and a permanent fixture. How do election management bodies deal with volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, which is not a passing phase, but has been accelerated now by the fourth industrial revolution and COVID-19? That in itself, I think, is key. Let me just highlight the following in the next slide before then I conclude. The first one, I think election management bodies or think tanks should begin to analyze and anticipate emerging trends that will define the future. What will be the future of voting? What will be the future of campaigning? What will be the future of party funding? What will be the future of election management in general? And begin to design laws in that sense. Dealing, of course, with complexity and ambiguity in a in the geopolitical volatility. That in itself also demands new soft skills for election management bodies. I did speak about the rise of identity politics and how people are mobilizing around religion, identity, regionality, and class, language, or cultural communities. How do election management bodies go up and beyond and be equipped to have the soft skills of diversity sensitivity training, such that they don't fall into the traps of the new identity politics, of the fake news and so forth. We may need more big data analysis and trend analysis, as well as the scenario, building exercises. We may need, the skills of dealing with complex stakeholders. I've spoken about the cybersecurity, and of course, the preemptive democracy education to counter the fake news, and also to bring back the youth. The youth in many countries have relatively stayed out of the election processes. And it's not just the voter apathy, it might just be the deeper crisis of legitimacy. Hence, they express themselves in the social media. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. It was very interesting to hear about the volatility and the things that different EMBs can do in this kind of situations, which I'm sure that many of the participants here will greatly appreciate. So with that, we're going to start with the country cases. And we'll start with the case of DR Congo, which will be presented by Reverend Crispy Kayembe, the Director of the Cabinet of the Rapporteur at the Independent National Election Commission of DR Congo. Reverend Kayembe has participated in the training of special Congolese staff to be used in elections and has been the head of electoral operations in duties to collaborate in staff training material, training organization, and supervision, voting procedures, data compilation procedures, and all other procedures related to result publications. Reverend Kayembe, when you're ready, you may begin.
Kayemba님께서 준비되시면은 바로 시작하도록 하겠습니다.
That's beautiful. So it was done the time. I'm going to present it in French. So I'm quite sure that Mr. Rushdie can follow me in French very well, and all others too. Je suis donc très reconnaissant à EWEB et à UNISA aussi pour avoir organisé ce séminaire par conférence, visioconférence. Et ici, je vais donner une expérience de mon pays, la République démocratique du Congo, en ce qui concerne la conduite des élections pendant la crise de Ebola comme maladie infectieuse. Évidemment, d'entrée en matière, nous savons que COVID-19 est beaucoup plus dévastateur parce qu'il embrasse tout le pays à la fois, toutes les provinces à la fois, alors qu'Ebola se retrouve coincé dans un coin localisé. Mais heureusement, au moment où nous avons organisé les élections, les dernières élections en 2018, il n'y avait pas encore de COVID-19. Donc, nous pouvons parler aujourd'hui, en ce qui concerne la République démocratique du Congo, de Ebola comme épidémie qui peut empêcher que les élections ne se tiennent bien. Qu'est-ce qui s'est passé? Nous savons très bien que la République démocratique du Congo, c'est un pays de l'Afrique centrale qui est aussi membre de la SADC, qui est très vaste, c'est connu, mais aussi ce qui est connu aussi, c'est que les réseaux de routes, de communication sont rudimentaires, ne sont pas très développés et le problème se pose de ce côté-là. Nous savons aussi que les voies de communication sont aussi très difficiles, ça c'est connu, mais aussi ce qui est aussi connu, c'est que le pays a connu beaucoup d'instabilité politique, le pays a connu aussi beaucoup de guerres civiles par-ci par-là, et actuellement, il y a plus de 150 groupes armés sur le terrain qui sont en train de causer l'insécurité ici et là.
There were 150 civil unrest in 2018. So when we were holding the election, at the time already, Ebola was widespread, in particular Around the western border, already Ebola was a serious issue that was threatening security and safety. In addition to that, it was spreading in other provinces such as Ituri and South Kivu. Therefore, there were blockages of these regions to prevent the spreading of Ebola to other provinces. And emergency centers were set up there in these locations to care for the patients of Ebola. And the emergency centers not only were set up, there was a tracking of patients, and we tried to manage the patients as much as we could. For the regions that were not blocked, we went ahead with the election process, but depending on the region, in the polling stations, we try to put in place a mechanism in which we could track confirmed cases. So Ebola had an impact on the western region, as I have said, and in these areas, the militant groups even would attack the polling stations and the polling areas. And they even attacked the emergency centers, and patients could not be treated in those emergency centers. So the police, military forces, and the government also worked together to combat these militant forces in order to protect patients and to resolve the issues, the problems that were arising in those areas. And when the other diseases broke out, including Ebola, various measures could be taken as we did in the past. Ebola was widespread in 2018, and the number of patients arose to 2,000. Furthermore, as there were Ebola crisis was coming to a point where it could be controlled, once again in the northern border area, there was a rise of Ebola. And so there was a time in 2019 that it became a nationwide problem. And so since 2018, it became a problem several times. And every time there was a spread of the infection, it led to high death tolls. And so, as I stated, Ebola broke out in different regions, and there were different strategies that were implemented to address the outbreaks. And the EMB worked with the media and other stakeholders of the election, and together had interactions. And there were efforts put in place to safeguard the workers. And for this, we felt that we needed a tracing system to trace where people were coming from and where they were going. So although although Ebola cases are still being confirmed, we felt that we need to prevent the spread by preventing the movement of the confirmed cases. So once a confirmed case is identified, that person should be isolated and traced and cared for. So by regions and communities, such contact and tracing mechanisms were put in place, in particular for those that working in logistics, such systems were especially useful. But those who were being affected by Ebola were those who could not get appropriate information, those who were marginalized in society. So in particular, those who were living in rural areas, they were the most hit due to Ebola, and we felt that it's important to improve communication. That's why we adopted a community training and education program. And to prevent the spread of the infection and to reduce the infection rate, guidelines were provided.
I think the speaker is having some problems. Yes, so I think we are having some technical problems with the speaker and he... Okay, can start again. I think, yeah, we did lost Reverend Kayembe. So until we get him back again, I think, Max, can you turn off the share screen? Yes, unfortunately, because of some technical issues, I think we lost Reverend Kayembe. So until we can get him back so we can listen to his presentation, I think we can move on. And we're going to hear the presentation from Mr. Henry Makabayi, Supervisor of Voter Data Management Department at the Electoral Commission of Uganda. Mr. Makabayi is known for his innovation of on-site designing and printing photographic ballot papers for the use during the members of Parliament of Youth, Worker, and persons with disabilities who are elected by the electoral colleges. So he will present on managing elections under crisis, and we'll unmute him.
Morning. I would like to first of all start by appreciating UNISA, AWEB, and the Korea Electoral Commission for organizing this webinar for us to share experiences, especially in times of crisis. And straight to my presentation. Okay.
Mr. Henry, when you want to go to the next slide, please say next.
All right, please. I would like to start by saying that the mandate of the Electoral Commission, in the case of Uganda, is to conduct regular, free, and fair elections and referenda. And this can best be realized if voters are informed and that they appreciate the electoral process. Article 67G of the Constitution of the Republic of Uganda requires the mandates the Electoral Commission to formulate and implement civic education programs relating to elections. And for elections to be free and fair, credible, an election management body needs to be mindful of the crisis that, if not well managed, can result into petitions, violence, and even death, thereby discrediting the election. Now, let me look at the crises that we normally face in elections. And these are, we have natural calamities and pandemics. When we talk of natural calamities, we have floods in lowlands, along riverbanks, along the lake shores. In fact, as of yesterday, there is a district whose headquarters are almost submerged by the River Nile. And we have to look at how we are going to manage elections in case these floods continue. We have prevalent landslides in this country, especially in the areas of Mount Elgon and Mount Rwenzori. We've had earthquakes in the areas of Rwenzori and sometimes with the border with Tanzania. Then we have drought, long spells of drought that cause migrations in the extreme eastern part of the country. We also have strong winds that cut across. Sometimes they come from the south, from the eastern, from the Indian Ocean and reach the hinterland in Uganda. Then when we talk of pandemics, Uganda has experienced Ebola before. We are now experiencing the COVID-19 pandemic, and these crisis situations cause displacement, thereby disrupting participation in election. Next slide. Loss of electoral, where other crises can arise out of loss of election materials. Very interesting case recently where nomination papers were lost from an office, and but we had contingency measures because we have these in many copies. We had to reorganize ourselves and reconstitute then the materials. At times we have had situations where errant people interfere with polling materials and at times election results, and in those situations we cancel those elections and reorganize them. There are times when we would have shortage of materials. Of course, this may arise due to lack of due diligence during packing, delay or non-delivery of election materials, delay to declare election results at times, failure to determine winners in hotly contested elections, destruction of infrastructure and election materials, displacement of polling stations, as I talked about the floods and the landslides, the perceptions at times that EMBs are biased because of the method the commissioners are appointed, registered voters sometimes not appearing on the register, or low or no coverage of voter education. Now, each of the crisis situations calls for appropriate means for providing information to voters to avoid the situation going out of hand. We'll go to the next. And now these crises may arise out of failure to comply with the law, maybe on the part of the EMB or even other stakeholders, failure to follow guidelines, acts of God, these are natural situations, technology failure, like communication network failure, misconduct by election officials or the political actors, communication gaps, even loss of time. For example, when we went into the lockdown, we have experienced a loss of time and we are trying to catch up with that because we have our elections slated for January this year. Go to the next slide. At times, the lack of transparency, lack of coordination with stakeholders, errant politicians whose intention is to provoke authority, criminality, poor and lack of quality control or insufficient due diligence. These are some of the things that I identify as probable causes of crisis. Of course, now to the theme of the day. The aims of the voter education and information are to sensitize citizens about their rights and duties, providing information about electoral activities and processes to voters and other stakeholders, and enhancing voter awareness and participation in the electoral process. It also enhances the growth of the democratic culture. Next, disseminators of voter information. There are, of course, there is a wide range of people, of institutions that help in dissemination of voter information. In our situation, we have our commissioners, they are at the peak of this. We have the Electoral Commission staff who range from those in the voter education department, other selected staff from other departments. We have district registrars who are also returning officers. We also have a lower level of sub-county supervisors and parish supervisors who are the voter educators at the grassroots. We also accredit civil society organizations to carry out voter education and information dissemination. And I think during this election round, we could be having like about 46 that have applied to do this. Then the mass media cannot be forgotten in dissemination of voter information. Even the political parties, because they are interested in getting the votes, they are part and parcel of the information dissemination process. Now, we have various channels of dissemination of information, and we have the traditional channels. We have promotional materials like posters, flyers, brochures, banners, t-shirts, and bandanas. Then the electronic media, radio talk shows, television talk shows, announcements, press releases, DJ mentions, bulk short messages, and also accessing information on our website, which is www.ec.or.ug. And when we come to radios in this country, we have about 300 FM radio stations which are spread all over the country. So these help us a lot in information. Then we have community radios like my colleague Rushdie highlighted. And in our situation, we have the Electoral Commission has identified about 1,126 community radios spread all over the country that are being used to disseminate information to the voters. And these are by way of fixed community radios. These are in a particular building with a loudspeaker where they air out the messages. And then there are also those which are motorized, motorcycles, a person on a motorcycle with a microphone and a loudspeaker riding across a period and across a place that is supposed to be covered for that voter information exercise. We also utilize the print media, newspaper, by way of newspaper articles, inserts, and announcements. Then we have outreach programs to institutions, factories, offices, institutions of learning. Then we also have manuals. We have like the information, the voter education handbook, like the one that I'm holding. It has a lot of information that we use in our voter education activities. We also have handbooks for election observers. We have handbooks for election officials and polling officials. Then our messages are activity specific. When we have an activity, say reorganization of polling stations, we normally organize a regional stakeholders meeting where we share with the stakeholders what we intend to carry out. And then from those stakeholder meetings, we have other disciples that can disseminate our message, those who are not working with the EMB per se. So these messages are specific to our activities, say demarcation of electoral areas, reorganization of polling stations, voter registration and the update of the register, the display of the register, campaigns, and polling day activities. We also hold evaluation meetings, especially after activities. Now, what are our experiences with alternative methods? I will specifically talk about the community radios. And for those that are fixed, these are normally located at junctions or in trading centers, and they are ideal for airing information to the voters from, say, at around 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. because these are the times when the people are at home and they can listen to them. Then for the mobile community radios. Motorcycles move around airing messages, and they cover a wider area than the community radios, because the community radios we are talking about do not have transmitters. They do not go beyond that small geographical location that the sound waves can move to. Then we have had to organize Zoom meetings, especially with our district staff, and these have cut costs of meetings, and they are also dependent on communication networks, because like you noticed, we are losing our colleague, Pastor from DRC. The communication links are challenges in some of these parts of Africa. Then we have megaphones that have been given for use by our parish supervisors as well, the voter educators, and these know the most appropriate time to disseminate information in their localities. They get feedback from the voters, and it's a convenient area of coverage. It's a relatively smaller area, and therefore a convenient area of coverage. When we talk about crises, we need to look at how we can manage them. And we manage them by having teams in the field to attend to emerging technical problems and challenges of information dissemination. Observing the law is really cardinal in terms of managing crisis, because when we disregard the law, the crisis may escalate. Benchmarking, and that is learning from others, because at times we may not have to reinvent the wheel. If one EMB has experienced a certain situation and we learn from it, then we do not have to go into the whole process of coming up with new solutions. We need to have a cordial working relationship with stakeholders. We need to provide timely and accurate information. And we need to show the stakeholders that we are mindful about any crisis that has arisen and their efforts being undertaken to contain the situation. Innovation and continuous learning would help EMBs to be on top of the situation, because situations change. So EMBs should continuously monitor and deal with these situations as they unfold, and making arrangements to provide for voter information to communities that have relocated. If we have a situation where landslides have affected the community and they have moved to another place, or floods, then we need to have arrangements to have those people educated when they are relocated. Now, come to the prevailing situation of COVID-19. The Electoral Commission introduced standard operating procedures with guidance from the Ministry of Health. These were on 4th of June, 2020. And in these procedures, emphasis is on minimizing physical contact. Staff are required to wear face masks while in public. That's when they're at meetings, talk shows, press conferences, trainings. Washing hands and having temperatures taken, going through normal security checks when accessing the Electoral Commission. Whenever persons are accessing the premises, their temperature especially is taken. There is a washing point at the entrance. Then sanitizing of the work environment is done in the evenings. And for those that do not complete that exercise in the evenings, it's preferred actually in the evening, so that the chemicals do not remain in the workplace by morning when we come back to work. Observing social distancing as recommended by the Ministry of Health, avoiding unnecessary movement within and outside the premises, wearing gloves while handling office documents and stationery. And then on 22nd October, a new standard operating procedure was pronounced regarding campaigns, because we are now in the phase of campaigns. Within 5 days, we shall be having nominations of presidential candidates. Parliamentarian MPs and councillors have already been nominated, and they are already in campaign mode. So there was guidance that there shouldn't be more than 70 people, and they should be wearing masks and exercising social distancing. And it is preferred that the gatherings that they have are in open environments, say a field. Then what way forward do I suggest regarding voter information dissemination? I think it would be really good if election management bodies considered setting up their own media houses like radios and television stations where they can provide information at their convenience. The last time I heard, I think Tanzania seems to have gone into that direction. I'm yet to verify. They held their elections yesterday. So then introducing voter education weeks or voter education months would be another way of enhancing information dissemination. And information that is shared should really be verified. You've heard about disinformation in this era of social media. Then we need to encourage this interdependence with other organizations, because then what we derive from synergies is much more than when we act as loners. And therefore we should cultivate working relationships with other entities. A case in point is utility providers. If we had working relationships with utility providers, they would, for example, print brief election messages on bills that they submit to their clients, and this would enhance voter information spread. And then the way forward is that staff need to be empowered with skills to disseminate voter information, because all staff, wherever they are deemed to know what goes on in the Electoral Commission, and therefore they should be equipped with that information to be able to share it with the outside. We should factor in feedback into our voter information provision cycles to enable enrichment of content. We should maintain visibility of the EMB logo and voter messages at strategic locations, especially in high population locations like sports stadia, markets, and road junctions. Participating in public activities of other institutions. In the case of Uganda, we have Parliament Week. We endeavor to go there. The International Trade Fair, school visitation days, national public holiday celebrations. And then we need to dedicate the International Day of Democracy to information, to providing information about elections. Then we need to produce monthly or quarterly bulletins that really highlight electoral activities that may have taken place or are due to take place. And then maintenance of telephone number banks would enhance dissemination of messages through electronic means. I come to a pictorial of some of the voter messages and then the crisis situations we have. For example, some of our messages are just pictures where we have like a layout of the polling station. Then this is a training session. These are really from the past, derived from the past. Then we maintain a complaints desk on every election day where we share information with whoever has called in, seeking clarification, seeking guidance, or raising a complaint, and then we make instant responses. Then the challenges that I was talking about, we have had floods. This is a place that was ravaged by landslides, a place that was ravaged by floods, knocking down buildings, washing away bridges. The district, the first photograph on the left is that of a district along the river bank of River Nile. A district along the river banks of the River Nile flooded, and we have to prepare to see how, if this persists, how we shall manage to relocate the polling stations of these persons. Then we have situations of drought where the voters in particular areas migrate, and we have to take the trouble to establish where given communities are located at the time of an election so that they participate in elections from their new locations. Then these are some of the standard operating procedures. You can see persons spaced out, waiting to be addressed at a rally. This was taken at a recent rally organized by one of the candidates. Then these are photographs taken during the recent nominations at our regional office, where there is hand washing at the entrance. Then there is a security check. And then, of course, there is wearing of masks while activities are going on, while the nomination is going on, while we are engaging with the public, while we are engaging with ourselves, we will have to wear masks. And then my conclusion is that information dissemination is very essential in having informed participation in the various electoral cycle activities. Crisis situations tend to affect how information is disseminated. This calls for a combination of traditional approaches and innovations that suit the crisis situation. The corona pandemic has drawn our attention to the fact that crisis can be global in scale and may be unified, and we need unified world action. It pays to benchmark approaches that other EMBs have to manage their similar situations. EMBs should be on a constant learning path that studies crises that have occurred in their operations and elsewhere to better equip themselves to manage them. I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. It was a very interesting presentation, especially the conclusion where you talk about combining what's traditional and innovative to see how you can get through the different crises. And thank you for sharing the pictures. I think we have Reverend Kayembe back in the session. So we're going to ask him to continue where he left off. Once again, Reverend Kayembe, could you unmute yourself?
I can speak now?
Yes, you may continue. Yes, you may continue. Please say next when you want your slide to be changed to the next slide.
Yes, yes. I was saying that, sorry, I'm going back to in French. Parce que les élections utilisent beaucoup de gens et que beaucoup des parties prenantes sont des logisticiens, des experts qui viennent ailleurs. Il y a beaucoup de mouvements sur le terrain.
The election involves various stakeholders.
Alors, nous avons installé ces mécanismes à l'entrée du pays, à l'entrée de chaque province et au niveau de chaque centre de vote.
Therefore, in a country, all of the polling stations will undergo movement of various people. Therefore, we utilize a contact tracing system and we receive the support from police forces.
Les masques, distanciation et aussi la prévention par l'éducation et la communication.
And so a lot of preventive measures have been taken.
Si je peux arriver à la conclusion, comme nous avons passé le temps, nous avons constaté que l'éducation de la communauté sur les le fait d'éviter
Regional community
parce que nous avons constaté d'après les recherches que Ebola
education was carried out that people should not be hunting and selling bushmeat because fruit bats were the source of the infections. That is why eating and hunting of such bushmeat was educated to citizens and communities. In addition to that, for the patients, there were situations in which during the burial ceremony of the patients, it had led to some infection, and that is why there was education carried out on such burial procedures, and PPEs were distributed to the polling station officials. And within the areas that were affected, all of the equipment that had been used could not be used in other areas, and it had to go through a sanitation process. And then what it was important was to identify the actual infected areas. It was very important to identify the infected areas. And emergency operation centers were set up in the infected areas so that the infected areas could be isolated from all other areas. And in the communities, we wanted to disseminate information as transparently as possible. And even after Ebola broke out, there were still many people who were still hunting and eating bushmeat. That is why in the rural areas, we wanted to work with organizations and civil society organizations who were closer to the citizens living in these rural areas to provide information about the dangers of eating bushmeat. And we wanted to utilize community radio channels to provide voter education and proper information on the measures that need to take place to prevent the spreading of Ebola. And now going on to hospitals and the medical system of DR Congo, I do have to admit that the medical system is not that sophisticated, but we do have medical staff and equipment, so we wanted to utilize the medical staff that we had as much as we could, and the government also was worried that the civil unrest may lead to negative influence on the election process. Therefore, the military and police forces cooperated in protecting the election process. And so this is my experience based on the election process that took place amidst the Ebola outbreak. And there are certain regions where accessibility is not easy. And so we really need to be mindful of that. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Reverend Kayembe. I know that it wasn't very easy
예,
to
감사합니다.
control everything and to finish on time with the
시간
technical
내에
difficulties, so
마무리를
thank you. And it's
하시면서
very
동시에
interesting to
많은
see how
그동안
the Ebola
발표를
crisis
진행하시는 것이 쉽지
provides
않으셨을
as an
텐데요. 이
example, and I
에볼라
hope it can be like
위기가
the
우리에게 어떤
example
교훈을
of how
제공해
we
준 것
can deal with
같습니다.
the
그러면서
COVID-19 in
에볼라
different
사태를
countries as well.
통해서
So
지금
now
각국에서
we will
겪고 있는
have
코로나 사태를
there's
어떻게
Sam
대응해야
Alfandika, the
되는지를
Chief Election Officer
배울 수
of
있었던
the
것
Malawi
같습니다.
Electoral Commission, present experiences
그러면은
holding elections this year.
말라위의 그
He has 15 years of
선거관리위원회에서
experience
오신
in
샘
electoral management and advisory both at
알판디카님이십니다.
national and
15년간
international level,
선거관리위원회에서
having
근무를
previously served in
하셨고요.
the Malawi Electoral
그러면서
Commission, UNDP
말라위의
Malawi, UNDP
선거관리위원회,
Nigeria,
UNDP 말라위,
UNDP Iraq,
UNDP
and
나이지리아,
UNDP
UNDP 이락,
Afghanistan.
그리고
When you're
UNDP
ready, Mr. Alfandika,
아프가니스탄에서도
please
근무를
unmute yourself and you
하셨습니다.
can start.
알판디카님께서 준비되셨으면은 음소거를 해주시고
I'm ready.
발표를
Can you
진행해
all
주시기
hear me?
바랍니다. 네, 다 들리시나요?
Hello.
들리십니까?
Yes, we can hear you.
잘 들립니다.
Thank you very much. And
네,
let me
감사합니다.
express my
그러면
gratitude for
먼저
allowing me to
감사
make a
말씀드리고
presentation and
싶습니다.
share the
이렇게
experiences
발표할
for
수 있는 기회를
Malawi.
주셔서 대단히 감사합니다.
You know, Malawi is one of the few
공유하게
countries
되어
that had conducted elections under the COVID-19 situation. So it's a privilege for me to share this experience with the rest of the world through this webinar. Next, please. As a way of an outline, I'll give you the background for our elections and then the COVID-19 pandemic situation in Malawi, COVID-19 preventive measures that were taken, and then how we managed to level the playing field under COVID-19, the challenges we faced, as well as the concluding remarks. Next, please. As a way of background, the Supreme Court of Malawi on 8th May 2020 confirmed the judgment of the High Court, sitting as a constitutional court in the 2019 presidential election case. The essence of the judgment was the annulment of the 2019 presidential election and an order for the Electoral Commission in Malawi to conduct a fresh election and determine a winner within a period of 150 days from the 3rd of February 2020. With this order, polling was therefore conducted on 23rd June 2020, and this was in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. The Malawi Electoral Commission had to address all issues raised in the court judgment before conducting this fresh presidential election to ensure that the irregularities that were seen in 2019 were not committed again during this fresh presidential election. So the election budget was at 38.6 million United States dollars and was fully funded by the Malawi government. Normally, elections in Malawi are funded by the government and development partners. But because of the sensitivity of this election, the development partners were not comfortable to support it. Next, please. Next, Suha. Since the first confirmed COVID-19 case in Malawi on 2nd April 2020, there had been a gradual increase in the number of cases up to a point when political activity was heightened due to the fresh presidential election activities. As of 2nd of June 2020, there were only 358 total confirmed cases in Malawi, with just 4 deaths. However, by mid-September 2020, there were over 5,500 confirmed cases with over 170 deaths in Malawi. Next slide. In terms of COVID-19 preventive measures, the Commission had to procure personal protective equipment, PPEs, for the use by permanent and field staff at all times. These PPEs included face shields, face masks, and hand gloves. And water buckets with taps, hand wash soap, and hand sanitizers were also provided during the electoral activities implementation. As a way of preventive measures, social distancing was observed when conducting all meetings, trainings, as well as registration and voting activities. Next slide, please. Posters on the importance of the following COVID-19 preventive measures, emphasizing on social distancing and avoiding handshakes, were developed by the Commission. And as a way of protecting our staff in the Electoral Commission, all pregnant female staff and all staff with chronic health conditions were ordered to stay at home. So our staff levels were affected during the implementation of the electoral process. In terms of civic and voter education, delivery channels had been limited to radio, television, print media, social media, and loud hailers. In this regard, use of all crowd-pulling public awareness techniques were suspended. This is due to the fact that the Commission did not want to pull a lot of crowds together because that would have been a threat in terms of spread of the COVID-19. Next slide, please. In terms of support from development partners, as I said earlier on, they were not eager to support the electoral process. But in terms of COVID-19 prevention, the United States government and UNDP donated the following preventive measures, materials to the Electoral Commission: protective masks, disposable gloves, face shields, liquid soap, hand sanitizers, plastic buckets with tap, plastic basins, and tablet soap. I'm mentioning this because in my presentation, I'll mention how much the Electoral Commission spent on COVID-19 materials. This is over and above these provisions by our development partners. Next slide, please. In terms of level playing field and COVID-19, I need to state that for any election to be deemed credible, a level playing field must be granted among contesting candidates or political parties. And to ensure a level playing field, an electoral process should allow as many mediums of communication as possible. So you can see these were some of the things that were affected by the prevalent COVID-19 pandemic. The Electoral Commission's outreach channels were, however, limited, as I said earlier on, due to social distancing and restricted gathering measures, which were instituted by the Ministry of Health through the government of Malawi. The contestants used all mediums of exchange, including crowd pulling campaign rallies. So you can see that while the Electoral Commission was mindful of the fact that there was COVID-19 and they were limited in terms of how to physically interact with the electorates, the contestants behaved differently because they still had to engage the electorates physically, and this provided or resulted into a threat in terms of the spread of the COVID-19. Next slide, please. In terms of the challenges, the Commission faced budgetary constraints due to the following. Procurement of the PPEs was not included in the election budget as it was prepared before the spread of COVID-19 pandemic. So a total of $1 million was spent on the protective equipment because of COVID-19. In addition, extra payments were incurred for services such as transportation due to COVID-19 preventive measures, limiting carrying capacities of buses and other vehicles, which were used by the Electoral Commission in its implementation of various activities of the electoral process. Also, limiting of public gatherings to a maximum of 100 people at a time meant that the training of tens of thousands of field staff required more days to implement and more trainers as well. So in Malawi, the Electoral Commission has to hire about 80,000 plus field staff, especially during polling, to conduct the polling exercise. So to train all these, we needed more days and more trainers because we were limited to only 100 people in terms of gathering at a time. Also, an increased number of electoral stakeholder consultation meetings and press briefings to instill stakeholder confidence. We needed to do quite a lot of stakeholder consultation meetings and press briefings because this was the first time we were implementing an electoral process under a crisis. And there are quite a number of changes that were instituted in the Commission in terms of the way we conduct our electoral process. And we needed the electoral stakeholders to understand this. So we had to increase the number of consultation meetings as well as press briefings, and this increased the cost. In terms of security, we had to bring in the military in the election security component to tighten the election security due to COVID-19. And that raise the cost of the election as well. Next, please. Additional challenges included the fact that there was competition for both financial and human resources in the country, because the very same time we are implementing the electoral process, the government had a daunting task to fight the COVID-19 pandemic. So a lot of resources went to the fight of COVID-19, while at the same time, a lot of human and financial resources were required for the implementation of the electoral process. Also, some stakeholders were not adhering to the preventive measures. I've already mentioned the issue of the contesting candidates and political parties not adhering to the preventive measures. In addition, the Electoral Commission's human capacity had been negatively affected, as vulnerable staff members were ordered to stay at home, as I said already. So this negatively affected the capacity to implement the process. Also, it was impossible for international observers to come to Malawi and observe this particular election. And to mitigate that, you see that there was an intensification in terms of local observation, and also some international missions residing in Malawi took up this responsibility to fill in the gap of the international observers. Another challenge was limited physical engagement with the electorate. You know, physical engagement is very important with the electorate during the implementation of the electoral process, but this was limited due to the COVID-19. Also, there were delays in the delivery of some election materials by suppliers. These delays came about because of the restricted travel, and then, most of the flights were suspended, and it was very difficult for suppliers to supply some of the election materials in good time. Likely, there were no critical materials that were not delivered before the polling day, and that's why we were able to conduct this election on 23rd June. Supervision of the printing of ballot papers by the Commission and monitoring of the same by the political parties could not be implemented due to travel restrictions, as the printing was in Dubai. You know, we printed our ballot papers in Dubai, and the normal practice requires that the Electoral Commission supervises the printing exercise, and also political parties have to send monitors to monitor the printing. This is for security and confidence building. But this time around, we had to engage the stakeholders, especially the political parties, and tell them that this is not a possibility because of travel restrictions, and we just have to trust the printer, they just have to trust the commission, and believe that the ballot papers will be printed in a manner that is required, as well as there will be no rigging due to any pilferage of those ballot papers. Next slide, please. In terms of solutions, to overcome several challenges outlined above, a number of measures were implemented as below. One, the Commission deployed a dynamic approach to the management of election. You know, these elections were unique. We're implementing the elections under a crisis for the first time. We didn't have the experience to tap from, so we had to deploy a dynamic approach to the implementation and management of this election. And secondly, the Commission made the contesting candidates to present the challenges and how they would impact on the conduct of this election. You know, we had, for the first time, instead of engaging just stakeholders, we had to engage the contesting presidential candidates themselves to make them understand why some of the issues or some of the activities are implemented in a different way. For these contesting candidates to go down to their followers to say they should understand the Commission, they should understand the situation the electoral process was being implemented in, and then do with what should take place under such circumstances. Also, the Commission held regular stakeholder meetings to promote transparency and accountability. Despite the COVID-19 pandemic, we thought regular stakeholder meetings were very important under the pandemic circumstances. One, to instill that confidence in the Commission and the electoral process itself, and to promote transparency and accountability in the entire process. The Commission also conducted timely press briefings and released regular press statements to keep the electorate well informed and to counter fake news and misinformation. You know, during the pandemic, because of lack of physical interaction with the electorate, you know, those who promote fake news and misinformation took advantage of the situation. So there was a lot of fake news and misinformation. To curb that, the Commission had to conduct timely press briefings as well as release these press statements to counter such fake news and misinformation. Otherwise, it was a very difficult environment to operate under such fake news and misinformation. Next slide, please. To come to the conclusion of my presentation, I wish to say that despite the COVID-19 pandemic, the Commission ensured that all activities for the election process had been successfully implemented and in accordance with the electoral laws. You know, in 2019, we made a mistake. Some of the electoral laws were not strictly adhered to. And in 2020, despite the COVID-19 environment, we were very mindful of the fact that electoral processes had to adhere to the electoral laws. And COVID-19 should not be a reason not to follow or not to adhere to the electoral laws. So we did that successfully. Despite the COVID-19 pandemic situation, the voter turnout was 64.81% compared with the previous 74% in 2019. The now and void votes were 1.26% compared to 1.54% in 2019. I'm bringing these statistics just to show that the COVID-19 pandemic, one, did not affect much in terms of participation by the electorate, and two, did not affect much in terms of voter information, and that's why the now and void votes were low or lower compared to 2019. The Commission is fully satisfied that the election was credible, transparent, and inclusive, and the election result was a true reflection of the will of the people of Malawi. Most importantly, the outcome of the election has not been disputed by any of the contestants. Also, the implementation of an election under COVID-19 pandemic caused a big challenge to strike a balance between the right to life and the right to vote. So this is something that perhaps was supposed to be kept in check during the entire implementation of the electoral process in Malawi. The experience of holding elections during the COVID-19 pandemic has helped this commission in Malawi develop strategies and practices that are resilient to future health crises. As the previous speakers have said, I think COVID-19 has taught us a lesson in terms of how the commission and how countries should proceed implementing the electoral process under such situations. And COVID-19 was a learning platform. And I think from COVID-19 pandemic going forward, electoral commissions have learned quite a few strategies which should help us sustain our activities. In my very, very final remarks, I wish to say that I think COVID-19 should indeed not stop the electoral commissions from holding elections, as countries, most countries, especially in Africa and beyond, rely on the electoral process to resolve the impasse in the political arena. Thank you very much for your listening.
Thank you very much, Mr. Alfandika, for the experiences shared for Malawi's elections. And as you said, because the pandemic in itself was not foreseen beforehand, it's hard to try to see what parts of the budget they have to be added or in order to be able to procure the PPEs for all the voters and the polling station workers, and to be able to give them also the education and information they need so they can be safe in the polling stations. So now we have our final presenter. We will hear a country case outside of the African region. Professor Seong Kim from the Korean Civic Education Institute for Democracy will present on the Korean experiences with dissemination of information to voters and the experiences they had for the 21st National Assembly elections this year. Professor Seong Kim has had a long career working at the National Election Commission of the Republic of Korea. She has worked as a director in the International Cooperation Division, the Cyber Election Crime Investigation Division, Political Crime Investigation Division, and an overseas voting officer in the Consulate General of the Republic of Korea in Los Angeles, California. She currently works as a professor in the Korean Civic Education Institute for Democracy. When you're ready, Professor, you can begin.
Hello, everyone. I'm Seong Kim from Korea, and I'm very honored to have this good chance to share knowledge and experience with all the participants today. From now on, I'll speak in Korean, so what I'm saying will be translated in English and in French. I hope that it is okay with you. 네, 대한민국은 올해 4월 15일에
So on April 15th, Korea held the 21st National Assembly election, and we elected 300 members. Of course, the coronavirus was sweeping Korea and the world. And so today I would like to talk about how in the midst of crisis, we were able to effectively provide information to voters. So in the midst of this pandemic, I would like to share the experiences that Korea has had. So providing information to voters includes promotional information as well as information regarding the electoral calendar. And also we provide information about the political parties and also the candidates. So if you look at Korean law, because of coronavirus, we had to provide information in an untagged manner. And so we use a lot of the media, and I would like to talk about how we utilize the media to provide information. NEC, as the EMB of Korea, carries out various roles. Registration of candidates, voting, counting, administering of elections is part of the mandate of NEC. And also we investigate election crimes and also carry out accusation of election crimes. And also we engage in PR activities. So these are the main roles of NEC. So if you look at the PR activities, we have to provide information regarding voting days, voting procedures, and if the election law is amended, we have to provide information on the newly amended election law. And also we have to provide information to motivate voters to take part in the voting process. And if you look at the methodology, there are areas where people get together, like conferences, seminars, or there are areas where there's a lot of commuters, such as subway stations or bus stops. So we visit these offline sites and we meet with the voters to provide information, and we encourage voters to take part in the voting process. Or we use TV, radio, internet portal, Facebook. We use various online media outlets to provide information and carry out promotional activities. And all of these activities have been carried out by NEC from the past, especially during this election. Because of coronavirus, it was very important to have untapped activities. And so we used media carry out our promotional activities. So the promotional activities have an impact on voter participation. So age, political preference, region is not a consideration. We try to provide general information to all voters of all age groups. And if you look at social media, we see the advent of social media. So not only traditional media, but we also look at social media such as portal blogs, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, these type of social media outlets. So if you look at the age groups or the different groups that use these different medias might be different. So we try to utilize various kind of media channels so that we can provide information to all voters. So here in this slide, you can see the channels that people use to get news about candidates. So in 2017, we had the National Assembly elections. And you can see for the different elections where people are getting their information. And so as you can see here in this graph, people rely on TV, also portal news and social media. So you can see where most of the voters are getting their information. And this year we had the 21st National Assembly election, and you can see where people are getting information about political parties and candidates. So TV, major news networks, you can see accounts for the lion's share, but social media, portals, these type of media outlets are also actively utilized by voters to get information. And here in this graph, you can see that the more they use medias, the more they use YouTube. And you can see that if they're not an active user of media, they tend to rely on TV and radio. So you can see the results of a survey. So in Korea, there were some revisions made to the public election law in Korea. And so we changed the voting age from 19 to 18. And also the National Assembly seat allocation method was amended as well. So I don't think I will have time to delve into the details of this, but we had an election April, but in February, we amended the law. And so we had to notify the voters of the amendments of the law. And in this COVID-19 pandemic, we had to maintain social distances and wear masks in order to cast our vote. So we have to tell people about the safety guidelines for voting in the midst of the pandemic. And here you can see the promotional activities that were carried out by NEC. We captured the TV screen. So we used TV to show videos to voters. So this is a capture. And here you can see these are also part of the videos that we showed on TV. And I captured a few screens. This is what we had in the newspapers. So on the bottom of the newspaper, you can see it's written Korea, but it says the 21st National Assembly election. And so it's telling people about the schedule. And so we use TV, newspapers, various medium to provide information to voters. Here you can see in the midst of the COVID pandemic, we are telling people how they can safely cast their vote. So these are some of the guidelines that voters need to adhere to. So we use TV, newspapers, various outlets to provide this information to voters. And here you can see our promotional activities on social media. So I've prepared this slide to show you the various activities that we are implementing. And this is talking about the safety guidelines in terms of voting in the midst of the corona pandemic. So Naver, Kakao, these are large portals here in Korea, and our voters utilize these portals a lot. So we work closely with them. So internet portal, internet websites, we had information displayed for voters, and we were able to increase the impact of our promotion activities. So here you can see we use Naver, Kakao portals to provide information to voters. Also, we use TikTok, Facebook, Twitter. Of course, they are global social media platforms. And using these Korean voters also use these social platforms. So we use these social platforms to carry out promotional activities and try to reach out to as many voters as possible and to provide information on elections. So we have been using media to provide voters information in an untapped manner. So next, I would like to talk about election campaigning for political candidates of political parties. So the election campaigning period is set. For presidential elections, it's 22 days. For National Assembly elections, it's 13 days. And so during this period, candidates usually, try to meet a lot of people, give speeches, and also hand out business cards with their careers on it and try to promote themselves. They shake hands with people and they carry out campaign activities to increase people's awareness of their candidacy. Because the election period is set, but there are exceptions. So using social media, doing online campaigning, sending text messages are exceptions. So you can engage in these activities not only during the set election period, but at any time. And so we have revised the relevant laws so that people can do this. So for this election, because it was an untapped election, in the past, candidates would directly meet voters. They would go out into the streets, deliver a speech, and actively give out their business cards. But because of coronavirus and to prevent the spread of coronavirus, there was a lot of online election campaigning using various online media channels rather than going offline, using offline channels. So for ads on TVs or newspapers, we limit the number of ads you can post, and also with TV debates, we have rules and regulations in place. But for social media, election campaigning, it is not part of traditional media. It is a new type of media. And so in Public Official Election Act, we have loose regulations. So even if it is not the official election campaigning period, you can engage in activities online, and candidates can more actively utilize online platform to engage in election campaigning. There is a regulation. Of course, Korea respects the freedom of speech, but if you disseminate misinformation about candidates and their families or slander another candidate, then that constitutes crime, an election crime. So those activities are strictly regulated. Of course, it is the same, I believe, in other countries. But if you look at social media, you don't have to invest a lot of money. And you can actively engage in campaigning. And at the same time, voters can access a lot of information. Despite the fact sometimes people are exposed to a certain type of information because of algorithms. So the limitations or maybe the nature of social media causes voters to have exposure to only a certain amount of information or certain types of information. And so when they are exposed, they can be exposed to fake news, or they can also be affected by, for example, confirmation bias. So if you look at Korean law, in Korea, you can use social media and online platforms to engage in campaigning, and the freedom of speech is respected. But as I mentioned before, if you post misinformation about candidate and their families, NEC can request that person to delete that information. And if the case is very serious, we can report that person, and we try to ensure the fairness of elections, and all of this is stipulated in our law. So we are cautiously and thoroughly regulating and managing misinformation. So during this election, we asked people if they experienced fake news, and about 17% said that they experienced fake news. And NEC we actually deleted misinformation contents of about 54,000 cases. If you look at this election, it was carried out under very difficult conditions, which is the corona pandemic, and I'm sure it is the same in other countries, but we made efforts to make sure that voters were able to safely cast their vote. So we worked closely with other government institutions, and the voters had placed faith in us. And so you can see that the turnout for this election was 66.2%. So as you can see here in this graph, compared to the past, we actually recorded a high voter turnout for this election. So in this pandemic, providing information to voters is, of course, more difficult than the past because it has to be done in an untapped manner. But if you use the media, you can effectively provide information to voters. If you look at the modern media environment, Korea's law encourages active use of media. We have high internet penetration, and also a lot of people use smartphones. And so I believe that the environment here was very conducive to using media to provide information to voters. I have briefly summarized the experience of Korea this April. I hope my presentation was helpful. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Kim. The presentation showed how the use of new media in these elections was done, and also it was very interesting to see how only 17% of the people who took the survey said that they have been exposed to the fake news. So thank you very much for your presentation. Because we are running a bit late on time, I originally wanted to have some time for Q&A, but I already saw Sam responding to the questions in the chat box. So what we're going to do is to take all the questions that are in the chat box and send them to the speakers. And once we give you the materials and the presentations for this webinar, we'll send you the answers to your questions as well. Finally, in order to be able to keep the time for this webinar, we would like to close the session by inviting Professor Esther Kibuka-Savitosi from the Thabo Mbeki African School of Public and International Affairs at the University of South Africa. Professor Esther, we're going to request you to unmute yourself. So once you unmute yourself, you may begin.
We have 54 countries within the continent with diverse environments, and the history of slavery, imperialism, colonization, independence struggles, coup d'etats, and now the latest neo-colonialism is really affecting our elections, because elections can be a tool for progress or it can be a tool for control. Therefore, this theme of dissemination of electoral information to voters in the time of crisis comes at such a timely era when we need to make strategies as we grapple with the COVID-19 pandemic. Mr. Rashid Nicodanian of IFIS reminded us to cultivate trust and democracy as we face the challenges of misinformation and emergencies. He urged us to build back better with resilience and really requested the electoral management bodies to invest in trust and the fact that they must not disappear from the face of the earth. He encouraged us to use smart and innovative voter education and strategic messages which are targeted to the specific voter. Professor Fikeni from UNISA stressed the importance of recognizing the opportunities in the middle of the crisis. And I think that is well illustrated by the speakers this morning. They have recognized the opportunities and have gone ahead to hold the elections. So he also cautioned us about the risks of cyber attacks, the challenge of data costs, and the inequalities that have been exposed by the COVID-19 pandemic, particularly in South Africa and other emerging economies where there was already inequalities, that these inequalities have been enlarged. He encouraged us to address social inequalities as far as data and technology is concerned. Among the other speakers, Reverend Kayembe described and critically analyzed the Ebola crisis, and he gave us so many important lessons to learn on how to avoid Ebola during the electoral management. DRC has been characterized by wars and political instabilities, but since the first attack of Ebola in 1976, the DRC communities have been engaging with this pandemic, and the recent attack of the 11th of July really was very serious. However, they followed the guidelines as outlined by the WHO and conducted the elections following the critical guidelines and, of course, vaccinations. Mr. Henry Makabai of the Electoral Commission of Uganda reminded us that the Electoral Management Commission is mandated by the Constitution to formulate and implement civic education. Therefore, even if there are many crises, as he mentioned, the crisis of floods, landslides, earthquakes, and so on and so forth, including the administration of elections, he really said that we need to get to take advantage of the innovation and continuous learning of the EMBs. In other words, the electoral management bodies cannot just sit and relax. It's not business as usual. They have to wake up and use strategies like community radios for voters and at prime time when the voters are at home. He also encouraged us to use the Zoom communication, online networks, and also follow the laws and benchmarking, as well as skills development as key strategies for working under COVID environments. Mr. Sam Ali Fandika from Malawi eloquently explained how Malawi successfully ran a credible and fair election under COVID. He said it is important to strike a balance between the right to life and the right to vote. And this is not really easy path to take. So the strategies for a resilient future referred to by Mr. Rashid was also exemplified by Mr. Afandika. He told us to really take upon a dynamic, strategic, inclusive strategy where stakeholder engagement is fundamental. He also advised us to counter the misinformation, fake news, and issues like that that go on around the election period. Professor Sue Yeon Kim gave us an eloquent paper backed by fundamental research on how to deliver elections information and voter effectively during an emergency. She drew upon the lessons learned by Korea when they held the 21st November Assembly elections in a rapidly changing social environment. I'll not summarize, well, they are not summarize our presentation, but I remember vividly what she talked about social media and the need to establish regulatory frameworks for social media. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't want to delay you so much, so I'll just highlight a few key points. This does not include everything that the speaker said. You have their papers. But one thing which comes to mind is the development of early warning systems for electoral management. This is very, very critical so that we can foresee and plan ahead. Secondly, the use of technology appropriately to inform the voters, educate the voters, and prevent crisis. Thirdly, to strategically target the messages which we communicate in this diverse environment of the electorate. I would also add that this diversity includes not only the disabled, but also engendering the messages we send out. So throughout the electoral cycle, these messages should also include the gender dynamics. We should follow the health guidelines, which means that the Ministry of Health and the EMBs have to collaborate. We have to build back better with inclusion and diversity strategies and taking key lessons from identity. We have to address the social faults within the healthcare systems, as well as the data cost, and invest early in technology, but above all, like Professor Fikeni said, mainstreaming voter education within our education systems. He also alluded to party funding. Now, this is a thorny issue in many of the countries in Africa. Informed participation and combined strategies highlighted by Mr. Makabai using the old and the new is critical. The EMBs essentially have to adopt a lifelong learning initiative. They cannot afford to go to sleep. They always have to keep learning, renewing, and so they keep resilient. We need an integrated strategy with all stakeholders. So stakeholder engagement, analysis in the elections are key. So as I conclude, I would like to just thank and extend our most heartfelt gratitude to the AWEB Secretariat and the National Election Commission of the Republic of Korea, who have co-hosted this webinar with the University of South Africa in Pretoria, that is UNISA, with the Thabo Mbeki School of Thabo Mbeki African School of Public and International Affairs. That is where I am based. So we are co-hosts and we're very glad, and we really invite you to take some of our courses, which I'll highlight later. I would like to thank the speakers, Mr. Rashid Nikadian, Professor Somadoda Fikeni of UNISA, Reverend Crispin Kayembe of DRC Congo. Thank you for really keeping up with the technical difficulties. Thank you, Pastor Crispin. Mr. Henry Makabai, thank you so much. Greet the Ugandans for us. Mr. Sam Alefendika, Malawi, we really appreciate your presentation. And Professor Su Yen Kim, thank you so much. And thank you so much, the Korean Secretariat. We want to thank our moderator. She was totally wonderful, Ms. Anna Kim Lee. Thank you, thank you. In Swahili, we say, asante sana. And I would like to thank the team, Mr. Suyeng Kim. I know he wants to keep behind the scene, but I just want to mention him because he was key in organizing this webinar. Lastly, but not least, I want to thank the participants. That is you. You have been so patient. You've been very well tuned in. You've been such an audience, which is so excellent. You've listened attentively, made notes, and you've been such an excellent audience. So I want to thank you so much for what you've done. And I also just want to invite you to our school, the Thabo Mbeki African School of Public and International Affairs. We've got many classes that are coming in, and we hope that we'll be able to have you when we start our courses in 2021. We encourage you to go to our website and check out this, because we're very excited with this. Thank you so much. God bless you all.
Thank you very much, Professor Ster, and thank you everyone who were with us, even though we went a little bit over time. So the final order of business for today is that we're going to take a group picture, so that in this area, in this UNTAC area where we take everything online and we're doing it with Zoom, we can have some souvenir of this meeting. So I would like to ask everyone to please turn on your camera so that we can actually take a picture. So we're going to take the picture. Our colleague Tina here is going to take all the pictures. So if you can turn on your cameras, please do so. And smile, everyone. Thank you very much for being with us. So this is the end of the webinar. I want to thank all the participants and all the speakers, especially our co-hosts, UNISA and the National Election Commission of the Republic of Korea. Our last webinar series of this year will take place in November. So we'll be sending out the invitations out for that one, and will be held in collaboration with the Fijian Elections Office and the National Election Commission of the Republic of Korea, and we'll have some studies and cases from the Oceania region. So I hope to see you all there. Thank you very much. I hope you have a great Thursday. So you can all log out now. Thank you very much. Bye.